This story is titled, My Mom and Stepdad Disowned Me and Left Me Out of the Will to Favor My Stepbrother. Now years later, they're begging for my help. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey Reddit! Never thought I'd be sharing my story here, but here we are. This one's been sitting with me for a while, and honestly, I'm still processing everything. Writing it out might help, so here we go. I'm not even sure where to begin, but I feel like I need to get this out. My life flipped completely when I was 14, and even now, years later, I'm still trying to process everything. Maybe writing it out will help. So here's the thing. My mom, Lisa, married my now stepdad, Steve, when I was 14. Before that, it had just been the two of us for as long as I could remember. My dad passed away when I was 7. Heart attack, completely unexpected. I didn't really understand what was happening at the time, just that one day he was there, and the next he wasn't. My mom tried her best to keep things together after that. She worked long hours as a receptionist at a dentist's office, and still somehow managed to be home in time to help me with homework or cook dinner. We weren't rolling in money, but we made it work, and for a while it felt like we were a team. When Steve came into the picture, everything started to change. He wasn't anything special, just a guy my mom met through a coworker. He worked random construction jobs and liked to talk a big game about all the projects he was working on, though I never saw him stick with anything for long. My mom, though, was completely smitten. He's dependable, she'd say, or he makes me laugh again. After years of watching her struggle, I think she just wanted someone to lean on. I get that now, but at the time, all I saw was some guy moving into our house and trying to act like he belonged. And then there was Tyler, Steve's 17-year-old son. He wasn't just part of the deal, he was a deal breaker, at least for me. From the moment he walked in, it was clear he wasn't interested in being part of a family. Tyler came with an attitude, a stack of bad habits, and zero respect for the fact that this had been our home first. At first, I told myself we'd adjust, that this was just new for all of us. But it didn't take long to realize that wasn't going to happen. Guess who was my biggest problem back then? Yes, Tyler. He was a lot. He had this cocky attitude like he was doing us a favor just by existing. He'd leave his shoes in the middle of the living room, dirty dishes in the sink, and trash everywhere. The worst part? Steve acted like Tyler could do no wrong. If something went missing or got broken, the one who got blamed is obviously me. One time, Tyler borrowed my headphones without asking, and then left them in his gym bag, where they got smashed. When I told Steve, his exact words were, "Well, maybe you shouldn't leave your things lying around." I felt my face burn with frustration. I didn't say anything, but that night I moved all my important stuff into my backpack and started carrying it with me everywhere. If they weren't going to respect my things, I'd make sure they didn't get the chance to ruin anything else. It wasn't just the headphones, it was the principle. How could someone casually destroy my things and still look so smug, like it was his right? And why did no one ever call him out on it? The worst part was my mom watching from the kitchen, silent as always. I wanted her to defend me, to say something, anything, but all I got was the usual blank stare. I think that was the theme of those years. Be the bigger person. Tyler would throw these loud parties while Steve and my mom were out, and I'd get yelled at for not cleaning up after his friends. The next morning, I left the mess exactly as it was. Sticky floors, empty cups, and all. When Steve and my mom came home, I was sitting in the kitchen, calmly eating cereal. Steve shot me a glare and muttered something about responsibility, but I didn't flinch. Let them clean it up for once. Then came something I didn't expect. My mom and Steve announced they were expecting a baby a few months after getting married. When they announced the baby, Steve's grin stretched so wide it was like he'd already won Dad of the Year. My mom beamed, clutching his arm like this was the best thing to ever happen. Meanwhile, I sat frozen at the dinner table, picking at my food and swallowing the lump in my throat. This wasn't joy. It was a warning. Another reminder that there was no room for me in this new family. Once the baby Ethan was born, it didn't take long for things to shift, and not in my favor. Suddenly, the house turned into a baby center. Steve and my mom were constantly running around, baby-proofing everything, while the rest of us were expected to just adapt. I started noticing little changes at first. A crib being assembled in the living room, stacks of diapers lining the hallway, and boxes of baby supplies taking over the kitchen counter. Then, one evening after dinner, Steve made an announcement. "We're going to need to rearrange some things for the nursery," he said, glancing in my direction. "It just makes sense for us to use the bigger room." I froze. I knew exactly what he meant. My room was about to be taken from me. The next weekend, Steve and my mom barged into my room armed with boxes and trash bags. "We'll just move your things into the guest room." As they hauled my stuff out of my room like a bad eviction scene, Steve kept tossing out lines about family sacrifices. If anyone was sacrificing here, it sure wasn't the guy stealing my room for a crib. It felt like a robbery. They barged in like amateur movers on a tight deadline, shoving my stuff into boxes and dismantling my room before I could even process what was happening. At least thieves have the decency to do it when you're not home. I just stood there, frozen, gripping the doorframe, as my world shrank into a cold, dark room down the hall. I spent the rest of the day hauling my things down the hall to the guest room, while they transformed my old room into the perfect nursery. Getting booted to the guest room was like being sent to the penalty box in my own house. No desk, no shelves, and the heater barely worked. Guess I should have been grateful they didn't shove me in the garage. When I tried to set up my study materials, Steve came in and told me to keep the clutter to a minimum, because the room needs to stay tidy. Well, now we have Tyler, the golden boy who could do no wrong, and Ethan, the new center of attention. Meanwhile, I was just there. I tried to talk to my mom about it once, but she got defensive and said I was being selfish. "This is your family now," she said. "You have to make it work." But it never worked. Steve treated me like a nuisance. Tyler was a constant source of stress, and my mom was too busy trying to keep everyone happy to notice how miserable I was. By the time I was 15, I'd figured out that no one in the house was going to look out for me. My mom was too caught up in keeping Steve happy. Steve had no interest in me unless it was to point out something I'd supposedly done wrong. And Tyler? He was just doing his thing, acting like a king in a house I didn't even feel like I belonged in. So, I adapted. I stopped trying to fit into their version of a family and started focusing on getting through each day. I wasn't defiant or rebellious. I wasn't sneaking out or breaking rules or anything like that. I just made myself invisible as much as I could. School became my safe zone. I joined every club that would take me to keep myself busy. I stayed after school to work on projects or hang out in the library. One day after one of these clubs, Mr. Jacobs, our advisor, stopped me randomly. "You know, you've got potential, Ethan," he said, tapping a stack of papers on his desk. "But you've got to think bigger. Don't let your circumstances limit you." I didn't tell him about my home life, but I guess he felt that there's something off about me. But the way he said it stuck with me. At that time, I started imagining a future beyond that house, one where I could finally breathe. Sometimes I'd even just wander the hallways, killing time so I wouldn't have to go home. When I wasn't at school, I'd crash at my friend Jamie's house. His parents were cool about it, and I think they could tell something was off with my situation. But they never pried. Home wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. Tyler made sure of that. He'd blast his music so loud the walls shook, invite his friends over to play video games until the middle of the night, and hog the bathroom in the morning so I was always late getting ready. Steve didn't care. If anything, he encouraged it. "Tyler's a teenager," he'd say. Like that was some kind of excuse for him to act like a jerk. There was one night that sticks with me. I came home around 8:30, exhausted after a long day at school and work. I'd started working part-time at a local coffee shop to save up for, well, I didn't know what yet, but I knew I needed money to get out eventually. Anyway, I got home, and there was a note on the counter. It said, "Went to dinner, back late. There's leftover spaghetti in the fridge." That's it. My mom, Steve, Tyler, and Ethan had all gone out for a nice dinner, and they didn't even think to invite me. I wasn't surprised exactly, but it still hurt. It was just more proof that I wasn't really part of their family. After that, I stopped caring about trying to connect with them at all. What was the point? I lost it finally when Tyler threw one of his infamous parties while Steve and my mom were out of town. I'd been looking forward to a rare weekend of peace and quiet, but instead, the house turned into a zoo. Random people I'd never seen before were everywhere. On the couch, in the kitchen, even in my room. When I tried to kick them out, some guy just laughed and said, "Chill, dude, it's just a party." The next morning, my room was trashed. Someone had spilled soda all over my desk, my backpack was ripped, and my headphones were missing. I was furious. When Tyler finally stumbled downstairs, I confronted him. "You're cleaning this up," I said, my voice shaking but firm. He just laughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You shouldn't have left your stuff lying around," he said, brushing past me. For a second, I considered grabbing him by the collar, but then I heard Steve's voice booming from the kitchen. What's all this noise? I knew how that would end, so I swallowed my anger and walked away, vowing that next time I wouldn't back down. That's when I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep waiting for them to change or for things to get better. They weren't going to. I started saving every penny from my part-time job. I didn't have a solid plan yet, but I knew I needed to get out. Okay, when I was 16, I almost ran away. I packed a bag with clothes and whatever cash I'd saved from my part-time job and made it as far as the bus station before reality hit me. I had nowhere to go. I sat there for hours, watching buses come and go, before finally trudging back home. No one even noticed I was gone. That was the moment I realized I needed a real plan. By the time I turned 18, I'd been mentally planning my escape for years. Every shift at my part-time job, every spare dollar saved, was about one thing: leaving that house and finally feeling free. I didn't tell anyone my plan. Not my mom, not my friends, no one. It felt safer to keep it to myself, like speaking it out loud would somehow jinx it. I didn't just want to leave, I needed to. Every time Steve or Tyler barked an order or left a mess for me to clean, it felt like a countdown. Each shift at the coffee shop wasn't just about earning money, it was about buying back my freedom, one paycheck at a time. And whenever Steve made his snide remarks about pulling my weight, I'd silently smile, knowing I was pulling more than my share. I stopped explaining myself and stopped trying to please them. Every ignored comment felt like a small victory, proof that I was done playing their game. My deadline wasn't arbitrary. Steve had been hinting at charging me rent as soon as I turned 18. If you're old enough to work, you're old enough to pay your way, he'd said with that smug grin I'd come to hate. I wasn't about to give him another excuse to control me. If I was going to pay rent, it was going to be for my own place. So I'd found a tiny apartment close to my college. It wasn't much, but it gave me freedom. The hard part was breaking the news. I waited until my birthday. I figured if I was officially an adult, it'd be harder for them to argue. So I prepared myself to have a decent conversation with them. That night, I went to my room and found that Tyler had left the living room in absolute chaos. Trash thrown everywhere and, as always, Steve acted like it was my responsibility to clean it up. "You're part of this family, Ethan," he'd said, standing there doing nothing while I picked up after Tyler. "Sometimes you've got to pull your weight." That was it. I reached my limit. I dropped the trash bag on the floor and said, "You know what? I'm done. I'm moving out." The room went silent for about 2 seconds before Steve burst out laughing. That same smug, "Oh, really? You think you're ready to live on your own? You can't even keep this house clean," he said, gesturing at the mess Tyler had made. "You'll be back in a month begging to come home." I turned to my mom, hoping, stupidly, that she'd back me up. She just sat there, folding laundry, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "Seriously? You're just going to sit there and let him talk to me like that?" She sighed, finally looking up. "Ethan, this is a big decision. Are you sure you're ready for this?" "Ready?" I yelled. "I've been ready for years. I've been dealing with this crap since the day Steve and Tyler moved in. I've been their maid, scapegoat, and invisible roommate all rolled into one. If they think I'm sticking around for more of it, they're delusional. And you want to ask if I'm ready?" "No, Mom. The question is, why haven't you stood up for me? Ever?" Her face crumpled, and for a second, I thought she might actually apologize. But instead, she said softly, I didn't want to make things harder for anyone." I laughed bitterly. Harder for who? Tyler? Steve? 'Cause it sure as hell hasn't been easy for me. Steve, of course, couldn't keep his mouth shut. "Oh, here we go. Poor Ethan, always the victim. Grow up. Life's tough, kid. You're not special." I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, my heart pounding with rage. "You know what? Keep the house. Keep the family dynamic. Keep it all. I'm done. I'll figure it out on my own, and guess what? I'm never coming back." I didn't wait for a response. I slammed the door behind me, cutting off whatever Steve was yelling as I walked out into the night. For the first time in years, I felt free, but I was furious it had to come to this. The first night in my new place was weird. The silence was almost too much after years of living in a house full of noise and chaos. I sat on the floor eating takeout because I didn't have a table yet, just wondering if I'd made a mistake. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. This was what I needed, a chance to breathe, to live without constantly being blamed or overlooked. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine. No one told me to clean up after them, no one stole my stuff, and no one blamed me for things I didn't do. It was peaceful, and I started to realize how much I'd missed that. I didn't cut contact with my mom completely, but I kept my distance. We'd text occasionally, and she called a couple of times, but our conversations were surface level. She never asked about my apartment or how I was doing, and I didn't volunteer much. Steve and Tyler? They didn't reach out at all, which was honestly fine by me. There was one time, though, when my mom called late at night. I picked up, thinking something was wrong, but she just wanted to talk. She sounded off, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she said, "Ethan misses you. He keeps asking where you are." I didn't know how to respond. I missed Ethan too. He was just a kid after all. But I couldn't go back to that house, not even for him. "Tell him I miss him too," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. Moving out was the best decision I ever made. It wasn't easy, and it didn't magically fix everything, but it gave me the space I needed to figure out who I was outside of that toxic environment, until my life shifted to a completely new level. One evening, seemingly out of nowhere, my mom called again. This time, she came with news. "Steve's been working on his will," she said, like she was mentioning a passing detail. "He just wants to make sure everything's sorted." I didn't say anything at first, unsure where this was going. After a pause, she continued, "He's decided to leave most of it to Tyler and Logan. It's just easier that way." I wanted to laugh, cry, scream, anything to release the knot building in my chest. Even in death, Steve made sure I knew where I stood. Second best. An afterthought. I wanted to ask my mom why, to demand an answer. But there it was. Clear, definitive, and somehow still a slap on the face. I'd never expected anything from Steve, but hearing it laid out so plainly hit harder than I thought it would. It wasn't about the money, it was about what it represented. Even after all these years, I wasn't part of the family. I never had been. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "I understand," I said simply. My mom hesitated. "You know, this doesn't change anything about how we feel about you," she added quickly, her words rushed and insincere. "It's just paperwork, Ethan. It doesn't mean anything." But it did mean something. Everything, really. I didn't argue. I just let the conversation drift into safer topics until we hung up. But the damage was done. That call lingered with me for days, a reminder of where I stood in their lives. After that, I stopped picking up her calls for a while. It wasn't out of spite, I just couldn't bring myself to deal with it. Instead, I focused on what I could control: work, school, my own life. I took on extra shifts, joined a study group to keep up with classes, and kept my head down. Living on my own was tough, but it was simple. If something broke, I fixed it. If bills piled up, I worked more hours. It wasn't easy, but it was mine, and that was worth more than anything Steve could have left me in his will. Life carried on and slowly started feeling like I had some stability. Then, out of nowhere, I got a letter from a law firm. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake or scam. I didn't recognize the name on the envelope, and it wasn't like I had a lot of dealings with lawyers. I opened it, and there was a letter. The letter was straightforward. My great-aunt Megan, someone I barely remembered meeting as a kid, had passed away. She'd left me as her sole heir. I didn't even know she was still alive, let alone that I was in her will. The letter instructed me to contact the lawyer handling her estate to go over the details. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I assumed it was some sentimental heirloom maybe, or an old photo album. I didn't call the lawyer right away. At first, I told myself it could wait. School was hectic, and my energy was stretched thin. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was scared to see what Megan had left me, because it would mean facing everything I'd been running from. The family who never really saw me. The sacrifices I made for people who didn't care. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about proving to myself that I could take this gift and turn it into something that mattered. A week later, I got another letter. This time marked URGENT. That's when I decided to look into it. I called the lawyer's office, half expecting them to tell me it was a mistake. Instead, I was informed that Margaret had left me everything: a house, some land, and a trust fund worth millions. I almost dropped the phone. Millions? It didn't feel real. The lawyer asked if I could come to the office to sign some paperwork and discuss the details. I took the earliest appointment I could, still half convinced there'd been some kind of error. When I got to the office, it was like stepping into a different world. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Halpern, walked me through everything. Megan had apparently been very wealthy. She'd invested in real estate, owned several properties, and made smart decisions with her money. She'd never had kids. And from what Ms. Halpern said, she'd always admired people who were independent and hardworking. She specifically mentioned you in her will, Ms. Halpern said, sliding a letter across the table. She wanted you to have the opportunity to build a life without the struggles she faced. The letter was short but heartfelt. Megan wrote about how she'd seen my determination from afar, how she'd admired the way I kept pushing forward despite my circumstances. She believed I deserved a fresh start, free from the burdens of my past. I didn't know what to say. I'd gone from scraping by on a part-time job to being handed a future I couldn't have imagined. As I sat there, staring at the papers in front of me, I thought about all the times I'd been told I wasn't enough, not responsible enough, not worthy enough. And yet, here was someone who barely knew me, who believed in me more than my own family ever had. It was overwhelming, but it also felt like validation. Once the paperwork was done, I had access to the trust fund and ownership of Megan's house. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood a couple of hours from where I lived. I decided to move in right away, leaving behind my cramped apartment and starting fresh. But word travels fast, especially in families. Within a week of moving, my mom called. She didn't even bother with small talk. "I heard about Megan," she said, her tone sharp. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it mattered to you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, it does matter," she shouted. "Steve and I are struggling to keep up with bills, and Ethan needs new school supplies. You've got more than enough to help." I was stunned. It hadn't even been 2 minutes into the conversation, and she was already asking for money. "Mom, I haven't even figured out what I'm doing with all this yet," I said. "You don't need to figure anything out," she said quickly. "Just help your family. It's the right thing to do." I told her I'd think about it, but I already knew my answer. I wasn't going to hand over money to people who'd ignored me for years, especially Steve and Tyler. The calls kept coming. First, it was my mom, pleading and guilting me about family responsibilities. Then Steve called, acting like he suddenly cared about me. He went on and on about how family sticks together, and how I was in a position to give back. Even Tyler chimed in, sending me texts about how he was trying to get his life together and just needed a little help. The last push came when Steve showed up at my door unannounced. I opened it to find him standing there, all smiles, holding Ethan's hand. Ethan looked confused, like he didn't even know why he was there. "Can we talk?" Steve said, stepping inside before I could answer. I crossed my arms, staying by the door. "What do you want?" He launched into a speech about how hard things had been lately, and how I could really make a difference for the family. "We're not asking for much," he said, smiling like he thought that would help. "Just enough to get us back on our feet." I cut him off. "You've got some nerve showing up here like this. Where was all this concern when I was living in a closet and blamed for everything?" Steve's smile disappeared. "That was a long time ago. This is about the future." "No, this is about you trying to take advantage of me," I said. "I'm not giving you anything. You need to leave." He tried to argue, but I wasn't having it. I told him to get out, and when he refused, I threatened to call the police. That finally got him moving. After Steve showed up at my door with his guilt-trip speech, I realized I couldn't keep any part of them in my life. Not my mom, not Steve, and definitely not Tyler. They weren't just toxic, they were relentless. It wasn't enough to ignore their calls or texts. They always found a way to claw back in, trying to manipulate me into giving them something. I knew that if I didn't put a hard stop to it, they'd never leave me alone. The first thing I did was meet with my lawyer again. I explained the situation in full, and they suggested taking legal measures to protect myself. We filed a no-contact order against Steve specifically, citing his unannounced visit as harassment. It was a harsh move, but one I didn't regret for a second. Blocking their numbers and social media wasn't enough. I changed my phone number entirely. I didn't tell anyone except a few trusted friends. I even had my address removed from public records using a privacy service, so they couldn't find me again. I didn't want to live looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next ambush. My mom tried every angle to stay in my life. She emailed me from different accounts, leaving guilt-laden messages about abandoning family and how much Ethan misses you. At first, I'd skim them just to see what new tactic she was trying. Then, I stopped opening them altogether. She switched to calling my friends, trying to get them to talk to me. My closest friend, Jamie, told me she'd called him crying, saying, "You need to convince him to talk to his mother." Jamie shut her down. "If he doesn't want to talk to you, that's his decision," he told her, and then blocked her number. That's when I realized I needed to cut ties completely, not just with my mom, but with everyone connected to her. I unfriended and blocked mutual friends and distant relatives who were still in contact with her. I wasn't going to give her a single avenue to reach me. One day, she sent me a letter through the mail. I don't know how she found my new address, but there it was, her handwriting on the envelope, plain as day. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The letter was exactly what I expected, a mix of guilt, manipulation, and entitlement. She wrote about how hard things were for her and Steve, how Ethan was struggling in school, and how I was being selfish for not helping. She ended it with, "You'll regret this one day when we're gone." That sentence pissed me off more than anything else. For years, I'd been the one they ignored, belittled, and used. And now she had the audacity to act like I was the one abandoning them. I shredded the letter and threw it in the trash. Then, I called my lawyer and asked them to send a formal cease and desist letter. If they tried to contact me again, I'd pursue legal action. The silence that followed was blissful. No calls, no emails, no letters. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally move forward without them dragging me down. It wasn't easy at first. Cutting off my mom, especially, was complicated. There were moments when I'd wonder if I'd gone too far. But then I'd think about all the times I'd been made to feel like I didn't matter. When they shoved me into a tiny room, when Tyler trashed my stuff, when Steve blamed me for everything, and when my mom just stood by and let it all happen. I reminded myself that cutting ties wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself. They'd made it clear who they were, and I wasn't going to waste any more of my life hoping they'd change. The only person I even considered reconnecting with was Ethan. He was just a kid, and I didn't want to blame him for the actions of the rest of the family. He'd written me a letter once, apologizing for asking me for money and saying he missed me. It was genuine, and I could tell he wasn't part of the manipulation game his parents and Tyler played. But reconnecting with him meant opening a door to the rest of them, and I wasn't ready to do that. Maybe someday, when Ethan's older and can reach out on his own terms, we can talk. For now, though, I need to keep that door shut. These days, I don't think about them much. I've built a life I'm proud of, a good job, a few close friends, and a sense of peace I never had growing up. Cutting ties wasn't easy, but it was the best decision I ever made. Walking away wasn't just survival. It was an upgrade. For years, I'd been running on fumes, but now I finally had the chance to hit reset. My life, my rules. Family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who show up for you. And if they weren't going to be those people, I'd find others who would. Thank you for sticking with me through this long post. Writing all this out has been both exhausting and freeing. And honestly, I wasn't sure if anyone would actually read it. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you taking the time.